Should you play Resident Evil 6 in 2026? Well, before you instantly click off this video because you think you know what the answer is, let me ask you this. Have you played this game before? Or have you already judged this game based off what you've heard others say? To add some context, I'm someone who has never played RE6, and I won't lie and say I was just frothing at the mouth at the opportunity to play this. Honestly, this was the game I was dreading the most out of the numbered RE games. Everything I heard about this game just seemed too bad to be true. Now, I've been playing games a long time, but to hear that a single game was the main reason why a franchise was on its deathbed was absolutely insane. Nonetheless, let me give my thoughts on Resident Evil 6 and you can decide if it's worth playing or not. I'm just going to dive straight into the gameplay, and I think this area is the sole reason why this game has the reputation that it does. Starting with Resident Evil 4, the game made a slight shift to more of an action-based style of gameplay, and then we saw a bit more of this in Resident Evil 5, but in 6, Capcom decided to go full throttle and have nothing but action. As someone who enjoys action games, even this was too much action for me. Coming off the other Resident Evil games, I thought it did feel like Resident Evil, but all the action muddied the waters, so to speak. To start with, the inclusion of QTEs is ridiculous. There is an absurd amount of QTEs in every gameplay section no matter the character you're playing as. This could be when fighting an enemy, performing a movement, or in the middle of what looks to be a cutscene. At first, these surprised me just due to the sheer amount of them. Every time you trip on an enemy or get grabbed, you have to perform one of these events. It just gets tedious after a while. These vary from pressing a button at the right time, rotating the analog stick in a certain direction, or rapidly pressing a button for a set period of time. Regardless of whichever event you get, you'll have to pay attention and remember what to do because you'll be doing them a lot. What's even worse is that you can't even look away from the screen because they pop up at the most inopportune times. I couldn't tell you the amount of times I glanced at something not on my TV screen and at the same second I ended up having a QTE. Moving on from that, the actual combat itself was pretty fun. No matter who you're playing as, you're able to sprint and use a slew of weapons to kill the infected. Just like in RE4 and 5, you can perform the stun and physical combo where you shoot the enemy quick and then run up and perform a melee attack to kill the enemy. I think this move you're going to have to abuse early and often because I found myself running out of ammo a lot. I wasn't even playing on the hardest difficulty either. I can only imagine how scarce the ammo is on those harder modes. It's weird because there are plenty of crates and chests to find the ammo alongside the enemies dropping them, but even still, I ran out. It doesn't help that once again, the creatures are spongy. To be fair, they're not as spongy as they were in Resident Evil 2 and 3 Remake, but man do they take a lot of bullets. I found what worked for me was figuring out what weapons had the highest damage per shot and using those when I really needed to. The shotgun and sniper rifle went crazy during my playthroughs as they would shred the bosses. So because of this, I ended up saving their ammo for later on and not wasting it all in the other segments of the game where I could get by with a pistol, machine gun, or melee attack. What is the weirdest thing about this game is that it has everything that makes Resident Evil Resident Evil. It has the infected, puzzles, action, entertaining story, but for some reason, this time it just didn't work. I can't quite put my finger on why, but this just didn't hit the same like the other games. Maybe it's because the horror element simply didn't exist. Especially in the older games, there was always this element of horror in each one. Not saying these games were really terrifying, but sure, you might get jump scared or there would be a sense of tension or dread as you went through the game. However, all of that is lost in Resident Evil 6. At absolutely no point during any of the campaigns was I actually terrified, and that sucked. If anything, this game reminded me more of Dead Space 3 in terms of how the game flowed and what we were doing. There was a bunch of action, but none of the substance that made the previous games so good. Even with me saying this, the action itself is really well done. I feel like Capcom said, well, if we're going to lead into the action better be over the top and grand, and it definitely was. Everything that happened in this game was just ridiculous. Literally every encounter, something was blowing up, someone was getting killed or flying through the air, or we were fighting these larger than life enemies. It seemed like this game could have been a Michael Bay movie with how the action was done. Assuming this is what the devs were going for, they nailed it right out the park. However, I'd be lying if there wasn't times where I thought, bro, this is actually ridiculous. An example of this is when fighting the final boss, as it has multiple forms and one of the forms is a literal T-Rex. I couldn't believe what I was fighting. But to that point, this should come as no surprise. During all the Resident Evil games, we have been fighting these crazy and larger than life creatures, but I don't know why in RE6 it just felt different. It's like it didn't fit, like a puzzle piece that didn't go with that specific puzzle. Going back to the combat, I loved how many guns you had at your disposal. Depending on who you were using, you had pistols, machine guns, assault rifles, sniper rifles, and more. As I already mentioned, understanding what weapon worked worked the best on which enemies helped so much during the gameplay. There were many times I was surrounded by enemies and by using some sort of grenade I was able to kill them all and escape. I think the weapons felt really good to use, as there was never a time where it felt off. The aiming and movement overall was better in this one compared to RE5. If you remember, in that game the aiming was different, as you had to line this laser on each enemy before shooting, and if you didn't have it lined up right on the enemy, you would miss. It was better for sure in this, where you didn't need to have it lined up perfectly on every creature in order to inflict damage. What I wasn't a fan of was the layout of the inventory system. I have no idea what the team was thinking when they were designing this. It is horrible. Technically, it functions exactly the same as it always has, but the way it looks is where the problem lies. When bringing up the inventory, you get all these squares that pop up in the middle of your screen where you're able to cycle through all your guns. Then when you want to add more to your inventory case, you get even more squares that you have to sort through, with you having the option to combine and discard items just like before. I think the inventory system worked best when having an actual case in a separate menu or a chest like in the remakes. Having all of this in the middle of the screen made everything a lot more cluttered and annoying to cycle through. In addition, you lost the ability to shortcut certain weapons and items, so every time I wanted to find something specific, I had to cycle through everything. It was really annoying. Then when you look at your health bar, it just looks so weird. You have all of these squares which represent your health, followed by squares underneath which are for your stamina. This HUD just looks ugly. There's no way around it. I would rather have no HUD at all than have this little bit that was included in this. It just makes everything more complicated and inconvenient when it didn't need to be. I didn't prefer how things were set up in 5 versus 4, but I would rather go back to how 5 was versus 6 easily. The inventory system works well when there isn't many items, but as you progress and get more access to other weapons, it becomes annoying to navigate. One of my favorite things about the previous games were the BOWs. If you didn't know this, it stands for Bioorganic Weapon, and these included a variety of enemies. These could be lickers, hunters, tyrants, etc. In particular, the tyrants were my favorite of these creatures because of how unique and memorable they were. Whether it was Mr. X, Nemesis, or another one, I loved them. However, in RE6, I just didn't care about these guys. They all seemed overly large, with them taking up so much of the screen for no reason, aligning right with the action focus of this game. Then in order to kill these guys, you have to go through long action segments with plenty of QTEs before being able to kill them. It's like when you ran into a BOW that used to mean so much more, but now they feel like just another annoying enemy. The qualities that made them special was just gone. Yes, they served as good boss fights, as fighting these guys was fun, but man, for them to constantly remind you that these were BOWs just reinforced this feeling that I had. Honestly, the gameplay for Resident Evil 6 is fun, but in an attempt to go non-stop action, the game veered away from what made the gameplay so addicting, the balance of action and terror. The story for Resident Evil 6 is different than the past games, as you have 4 campaigns where you can play as a small cast of characters. When going through the game for the first time, you have to play through Leon, Chris, Jake, and Ada's campaign in order to get the full story. I don't mind playing games where you have to play it multiple times in order to understand everything, but in this game it was just okay. None of these character stories were bad, I just thought it was unnecessary to have us play campaigns as all of them just to see what they were doing in different areas within the game. Honestly, I would have rather had playable segments with the others while inside of Leon's campaign. Like you play as each character for certain moments during his story, with you eventually going back to him later on. Of course that's not what we got, so I pushed through playing this game 4 times, which felt like a chore after Chris's campaign. The story is based upon discovering who was behind the most recent outbreak and who was behind distributing the C virus. As I've mentioned in previous reviews, the story for Resident Evil is never the main attraction, but I think in this game it's especially true. The pacing for the story isn't the best, and even though there are notable characters, I just wasn't that invested. If something happened to Leon, Chris, or Ada, then yeah, I was interested, but other than that, I was just like, yeah, whatever. What I did like about the story was seeing how each character handled what was going on and why they were acting the way they were, especially during Chris's campaign, as the decisions he made in RE5 is felt all throughout his story, and his motivations for his decisions in 6 is made very clear. Since I am a fan of the series, I was entertained by the story, with seeing what the C virus does to his host on top of the little nuggets of information that differed from character to character. I loved seeing the impact of the choices from before have an effect on the characters and how they act now. All the chase sequences, large explosions, and over-the-top moments make this story appear larger than life. This sounds great on the surface, but in the end it just holds no weight. The story is high octane and throws a lot of action at you within each campaign. I think Leon and Chris's campaign are the most important, and if you're like me, you might find going through the other ones a bit of a slog. Regardless, if you enjoy Resident Evil, you will like this, just not as much as before. Overall, Resident Evil 6 is not a horrible game, but it isn't good. To put it simply, this just doesn't feel like Resident Evil. Yes, at its core, there's still elements of the game that have always been there. The bosses, action, story, all line up with what we've always had, but the overabundance of QTEs along with too much action and pretty much no horror makes this feel like a completely different franchise, and I think if you enjoyed the previous Resident Evil games, you liking this will be a complete toss-up. So should you play Resident Evil 6 in 2026? I would say only if you're a big fan of Resident Evil and want to know the story. In addition, make sure it's on sale too. After finally playing this game, I see why many say this game almost killed the Resident Evil franchise. It was so different than what we had before, it felt as if this franchise had lost its identity. If I had given a score to this game, I would give it a 6. And honestly, I rated that high because I love this franchise. I would totally understand if you were to give it a lower score. Thankfully, this franchise didn't die and it's now thriving, and that is mostly in part to Resident Evil 7. So I'm looking forward to playing that next and giving my thoughts on that game. What did you think about Resident Evil 6? Did you play this, or are you hearing about it for the first time? Let me know in the comment section below, and if you enjoyed this video, feel free to watch one of my other reviews right here.